Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and we'll highlight what's working in your rural communities. You'll hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf.
Some places talk about rural schools as an afterthought. David Little has made them the headline. He's the executive director of the Rural Schools Association of New York State, a policy veteran who spent years in and around Albany translating capital talk into what actually works for small districts. He's crisscrossed the state listening to families and educators. He's led tough conversations on funding formulas and mandates and has helped craft a roadmap for what it really takes to keep opportunity alive in rural New York. Today, we're digging into the work behind the headlines, how the association turns phone calls from tiny districts into action, what lawmakers need to understand about foundation aid and mid-year shocks, why safety, special education, and things like school-based health can't be unfunded mandates, and what to do about zero-emission bus timelines that don't fit the map. So we're going to connect policy to practice and share some bright spots in services and workforce pipelines and talk about how rural communities are doing the hard work of staying. So let's get into it. Dave, thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Melissa. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to get started with where you've come from. So before you were with the Rural Schools of New York, you spent years as the chief lobbyist for the New York State's School Boards Association and earlier as counsel in both chambers. So can you talk about how that path shaped the way that you fight for rural schools today?
Yeah, the first 17 years of my career, I was legal counsel first to the Assembly and then to the Senate. While I was spending 10 years as a school board president here locally at my alma mater, I started that for the same reasons most people join the school board. I had small boys that were starting school, and there were things about my alma mater that I thought improved for their benefit as they start. And so did that. Really fortuitous. I was up at a school board president's academy for the State School Boards Association in Lake Placid and met their executive director who asked what I did. And when I told him, he said, "We're looking for a director of governmental relations." And so that led to going there. And then I actually knew that it's starting to look like it with the beard, but this is my 43rd legislative session and my last. And so after 32 years in the state retirement system, I moved over to the Rural Schools Association and knew 6 months before I left school boards that I was going to be doing this. And I had been their liaison. I had been Rural Schools liaison to the School Boards Association. I was typically a speaker at Rural Schools Summer Conference, that type of thing. And around the educational policy tables where decisions are made in Albany, I had long since noticed that the one group that was missing were the third of our students and the half of our school districts that are rural in New York State. The Rural Schools Association has 330 school districts in it that identify themselves as being rural and needing our help. My unofficial rule for joining RSA is simply, do you think you're rural and do you think we can help? There are all kinds of determinants within the U.S. Census and whether you're truly rural or rural adjacent and all of those things. And I kind of threw all those out the window and said, if you think you're rural and you think you have rural issues, we want to be there for you. So we built ourselves up and luckily, because I spent all that time with these policymakers over the years, they know who I am. They know what I'll be talking about when I get there. And it's made us much more visible and hopefully influential.
How did your time as the Home Rule and Local Government Counsel really teach you about the gap that exists between Albany and those small rural communities that you now work with?
Yeah, one of the things that I did there is actually one of the things that told me it's probably time to retire. One of the first things that I did there was help draft and negotiate the public-private funding partnership that built Ralph Wilson Stadium for the Buffalo Bills. And they're now that their season's over, they're tearing that stadium down and building a new stadium. And so when projects that you've done become obsolete, it may be time to go. But I spent an awful lot of time during that time. Home rule is an interesting concept in New York. We are a home rule state, which means there's a provision of our state constitution that says you can only pass legislation that affects only one municipality with their permission, right? So way back when, and this is what happened to me as I walked through the door, Staten Island wanted to secede from New York State and be part of New Jersey. It sits right in the middle of New York Harbor. And so, and the determination was whether or not Staten Island needed to officially be asked whether they wanted to do that before the legislature would do that to them, right? Mm-hmm. Well, there are 4 exceptions to that general rule. 4 places in the state constitution where the state has plenary authority, whether localities like it or not. And that's the police power. So if you have local sheriff's deputies, it's only because the state of New York has decided that's how it wants to uphold its constitutional responsibility to provide the police power to people. Okay. State police or environmental police, whatever you happen to have, it's all part of their system, even if they're local police. Well, they have the same thing for the courts, for taxation, and public education. We have the same provision in our Constitution that every state has that says every child is basically entitled to a sound basic education as a constitutional right. And so when I was Home Rule Counsel, I would frequently, and I have to back up because also in New York's law, public school districts are municipalities. They're independent municipal taxing jurisdictions subject to what I just said about the state having plenary authority. But they're just like a town, a village, a county. And so I would look at those things and determine whether they needed to start the process or whether the state needed to start the process for them. And it gave me a whole lot of experience in budgeting and a whole lot of experience about how local municipalities work. I had also been a regional planning commissioner and a county legislator. So I had all of that in my hip pocket to do that work, all of which kind of built up to one thing leading on to another to be able to lead this association from being what it was when I got here to predominantly an advocacy and professional development organization, an information-based organization. And so now, really what I'm trying to do is to make sure that state and federal leaders understand what the implications of their proposals might be on rural schools. And the example that I always use, just because it's such a graphic example, our commissioner of education, which in most states would be called a state superintendent of education, our commissioner of education had been the chancellor of our board of regents, our state school board. And while she was there, she had proposed, because she was from the Bronx, and New York City had a profound problem with getting qualified substitute teachers. It wasn't just a body in the room. Even the body wasn't the kind of person that you would want in the room, right? And so she wanted to pass a regulation saying that every substitute teacher in the state of New York would need to be certified in the subject that they were going to be subbing in. And I had to call her up immediately. And fortunately, we have a great relationship. But I said, Betty, all you've done by proposing this regulation is ensuring that every rural school in New York will be out of compliance from the first till the last day it's in effect. We can't comply. If we had those people sitting around in their basements waiting for the third Thursday of the month to teach chemistry, we would have hired them already because we can't get those people. right? We have a severe problem with trying to get school staff right now. And so trying to make sure that our leaders, who are typically never farther than north of the Tappan Zee Bridge, they don't have a rural perspective. And so, making sure that they understand how a policy that in their mind was played out either for the cities or for the other big four school districts, Albany, Yonkers, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo. So many of our state legislators and leaders come from those areas by sheer population that they pass things without ever considering how it's going to play out in a small district where literally your superintendent, and I'll give credit where it's due, the Newcomb Central School District up in the Adirondacks, he's retired now, but my friend Skip Holstrom up there was literally the superintendent bus driver. And not a bus driver, the bus driver, right? So every kid got picked up by Skip, and then he was their superintendent all day long, and then he took them home, right? So if you're adding additional duties, responsibilities onto that person, how can you do that in good conscience or organizationally thinking it will even be effective? Right. So there has to be a give and take back and forth. I need to know what our members think continually, how it would play out for them. And then I need to translate that to leaders. And then I need to take the information from those proposals back from leaders and make sure that rural people know what's likely to happen or what they can help prevent from happening, and make sure that the whole thing works in our state. Because there are too many kids. People don't think of New York largely as being rural. It's on our masthead for years, I had a picture of Times Square at night, and it said, "I'm not from New York." And then it had a picture from up on top of Whiteface Mountain that you can see for 100 miles in every direction, and there's not a building, right? And underneath that that caption was, "I'm from New York." Right? They don't understand that how much of this state is rural. We have one of the largest populations of rural students of anywhere. And, you say you're from New York and they assume the city, but they know the names of all of our rural places. They know the Catskills and the Adirondacks and the Finger Lakes and the Thousand Islands and the Niagara Falls and all these places that they can name and would want to vacation in. Those are our rural places in New York, and it's a vast amount of territory where, almost half of our school districts serve.
Yeah. Dave, when you have a call from a superintendent, small school, they call RSA, what are the top two problems that you're trying to solve with and for them? And what is it that they need from you to move that phone call into action?
Well, Melissa, you mentioned the fact that we did a series of rural issues forums regionally. We did 14 of them around the state. I got so close to Canada that Verizon told me what my Canadian data rates were going to be, and all the way from Montauk, which, if you go any further out on Long Island, you're in the water someplace, and then in Connecticut or Rhode Island, and all the way to Jamestown on the other end of the state, which is by Erie, Pennsylvania. So we covered it all to make sure that we knew the most timely and relevant challenges and issues that our members have. And then I put that together in a policy brief that we're calling The Hard Work of Staying. And because I stole it from Wade Alette, your 2018 NREA Rural Teacher of the Year, I want to give him credit. I do give him credit in the document itself. That's the tagline on the bottom, that telling us where the hard work of staying came from. But it was particularly valid in New York State because people don't recognize it, and our state leaders never even acknowledged it. But during the Great Recession prior to the pandemic, New York State's rural areas experienced the second largest outward migration in U.S. history, second only to the Dust Bowl of the Depression.
Wow.
And we lost 1 million people out of one section of one state. And it's had a profound impact. And so, I say, as Wade does, that the people who remain are doing the hard work of staying. If your families have been uprooted and they didn't leave voluntarily, they left because their employment left, right? They left to find work. And so all of that tax base has hollowed out rural New York. And the people who stay have a larger financial share, a larger financial burden. They have a larger civic responsibility of just making sure everything still works with fewer people doing it. And so it is the hard work of staying. And so as we went around the state, a lot of things have happened as a result of the recession and as a result of the pandemic. Funding is perennially rural schools' largest issue because cling to enrollment. Enrollment determines everything.
Right.
They come up with an amount and they adjust it by the number of kids in the seats. And we live in an age when that just can't be the case anymore, because I found in our rural issues forums around the state, I'll give you an example, in Plattsburgh, up in the North Country, the Northern Adirondacks, this year they've experienced a special ed identification rate of the kids who need special services, 50%.
Oh, wow.
Half of all kids coming into kindergarten this past year needed special ed. And the number of children needing mental health services is profound. It's tragic. And you think about the world that they're growing up in. I mean, born in the pandemic, the toddlers during the pandemic, coming into school in an age when they're likely on any given night to go home, and the first thing they see is the latest horrific school shooting where how many kids have been slaughtered. The worst thing I had to think about was some remote concept that if I dove underneath my desk, I'd somehow survive a nuclear blast. That was our thing as a kid. That was nothing compared to live video that they can see on any given night of kids being killed. Right. And so the emotional trauma of that, the lack of programming in comparison to the highly served districts in New York State. Now, I'll just give you, we have, on average, New York State pays the most per child for public education. And yet that's the ultimate example of having 1 foot in boiling water and 1 foot in ice water and saying, on average, you feel okay. Because we have Shelter Island, Fire Island that pay north of $130,000 per child. It's an astronomical amount. And we have very small rural districts that can't raise even $8,000 per child. And somehow the state thinks that they're upholding their constitutional obligation by allowing that system. We spend the most per child on average, but we also get rated by Education Week and Quality Counts every year as having the worst distribution system in the country. For as long as I've been around, we've been the worst, because although most states pay about 2/3 of the cost of public education, New York State actually pays 1/3 and expects local taxpayers to pay the rest. And so it's a dramatic difference as to whether or not your community has resources or doesn't. And the education your child receives is all dependent upon where you live. And so the education is always our top one. But mental health services, trying to get staff in rural areas, specialty subjects, everybody has this issue. Specialty subjects, special education, school psychologists and social workers, can't find them. And they're simply not willing to drive all the way out to one rural area. Even if you share with somebody else, they spend half of their day getting to work, going to the 2 districts and going home. So it's not productive. And so we're trying very hard to see if we can get more online services provided to rural areas, simply because we can't get the physical people into our districts. We've got a great system. The Board of Cooperative Educational Services is BOCES. That's our regional service provider. And the state incentivizes our use of that. If 2 districts can get a service approved and want to share a school psychologist, the state will pay them whatever their reimbursement rate is. And it may be upwards of 85% of the cost of that they can back in the next year. You still have to get that person through the door. And so far, we're having a real challenge trying to do that. So that student mental health. And then we have a real issue in New York of state mandates. If you think of why business doesn't come to New York, it's typically because of our robust bureaucracy, right? It's not easy to do business here. It's costly to do business here. There are high taxes and high debt, but if you're a business coming into New York, you may very well have the one thing in New York coming up that will give you what you've always clamored for. As long as I've been around, business has said, you don't give us the workforce that we need. So I ask, what do you need? Well, we need workers who have a work ethic, who can collaborate, who can communicate, and who can problem solve. And we're implementing, operationalizing Portrait of a Graduate, which is designed to do all of those things. We just changed as a state, we changed our graduation requirements, having each individual district be able to choose their own pathways to show proficiency in the standards. And that was a tremendous step forward to recognize that Salmon River is not the same thing as Chappaqua, which is in Westchester, a suburb of New York City, and one of the wealthiest places to live in America. They're completely different. And so, their children's ability to show proficiency, it needs to be done in different ways. They do different things to educate in those places. And so the one thing that would stand in the way of our being the one state, or certainly the foremost state, that can provide those kind of skills to the workforce that they say they want, is if we keep trying to fund public education according to how many kids are in the seats and not what those kids need. If you're trying to do something brand new and you want to fund it according to the rules of something that is a generation old, it's a recipe for failure. And so that's probably our biggest challenge as we're moving forward, is these mandates. New York State loves to say, we'll give you a little more money. We never take away something that you already have to do. We layer it on top. And the latest and most dramatic is that our governor has laid out a plan that by the mid-2030s, every school bus in New York will be electric. It will be a zero-emission vehicle. I believe, and I have no information that would back this up, it's just my belief that there had to be some kind of an understanding with the prior administration that there would be federal funding behind that effort. Maybe make New York State an example, show that it can work, and then try and spread it to the rest of the country. If you've ever seen a line of kindergartners standing waiting to get on the bus in the winter with diesel fuel coming out right at face level on them, out the tailpipe, you understand what they were trying to get at, right? But in New York, we have both a tax cap and insufficient funding for our small rural schools. And so they've literally created a Hobson's choice between having an environmentally sound ride to school or making the ride worthwhile once you get there. Because that diesel bus is 4 times the cost. Well, a diesel bus is 1/4 of the cost of an electric bus.
Wow.
So you're going to spend $400,000 on one bus in a state that has a tax cap where many of my rural schools don't raise $100,000 under the tax cap. And so trying to pay inflationary costs, and to make matters even worse, I don't want to really get into the weeds here, but to make matters really worse in New York, our communities, our school districts vote on their budgets. So they have the ability to vote this down. So how can a school district say in compliance, the people say, no, we're not voting for electric buses, and the state says you have to have them. Well, you're only out in that circumstance is to cut something else. And many of our rural schools are struggling to meet the bare minimum requirements for graduation right now. So they're in a really tough circumstance. We hoped that because this was an election year and our funding tends to go in waves, it peaks in an election year, kind of goes into a trough in the middle where they try and recalibrate, and then it peaks again in the next election year. It's an election year. We expected that some of these flatlined budgets that we've had the last couple years would finally break loose for us, and we could try and restore some of the things that have had to be cut during that time. And instead, yesterday, we got an across-the-board 1% increase when inflation, even consumer inflation, is 2.7%. And schools don't engage in consumer inflation expenditures. I mean, in New York, we have to contribute to the state retirement system for our employees, and that's a double-digit employer contribution every year. Our healthcare is also a double-digit employer contribution every year. And so 2.7% isn't even in the realm of our reality. And yet we're going to get a 1% across the board from the state with a tax cap that is capped at 2%. So neither our state aid nor our local taxation can even come close to trying to keep us in the realm of even consumer inflation. So there will be cuts. And cuts in an era where the state is trying to do this historic turnaround to try and implement Portrait of a Graduate, which will take funding for new professional development and new things, trying to create linkages between our local businesses and our students to try and get that real world experience that business says they want. Got to have people who can coordinate that type of an effort. They never went to school for that. There's no college course that tells you how to do that, especially in a rural area where there aren't a lot of choices. And you can't go to your one local employer and say, hey, can you take our entire senior class for 6 months to show them how business works? That's a little onerous. You want to try and support those people who are doing the hard work of staying, rather than increase the burden on them. So tough circumstance yesterday was kind of a tough pill to swallow. We expected a little more, at the very least, intellectual rigor in putting that proposal together in a way that you would normally expect from the governor, even when they do something that we would consider untoward. It's usually well thought out. All they did was say, roll it over and give them an extra %. It didn't take them 3 seconds on their computer to do that. They just hit a button and hit 1%.
Right.
And all of these kids who have been through so much, no generation has ever gone through what they've gone through. They deserve better. They simply deserve better.
Dave, can you talk? I appreciate the hard work of staying as really a broad strokes look at many of the things you're talking about, whether it's foundation aid, special education, school safety, transportation. It is very wide ranging. There's a lot to digest. If you are anticipating, and I hope that they do, that the lawmakers in New York are paying attention to this work that you're putting out, what's the one takeaway that you want them to have from this report? What should that be?
To me, we're at a pivot point in our history, if not as a country, as a state. And are trying to implement Portrait of a Graduate. There have been other, we know the names of them all, Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind. And every few years we seem to get a new acronym and a new national effort. Well, Portrait of a Graduate, at least in my mind, works. It works for what we say that we need. And so we have this confluence of, here's what we need, and we actually know how to do it. That's rare. I'm not kidding. 43 years in doing state government and public education, those things don't align up. They don't align very often. And so it does. And it has the possibility of working and turning around historic challenges we have. You've got to have the political courage to not simply say everybody gets 1%. There's only one reason for saying everybody gets 1%. And that is, I don't want chaos. I don't want winners and losers under a brand new funding formula. I don't want to have to deal with the politics of that while I'm running for election or reelection as either a state legislator or the governor. I want to forestall that cacophony, until after the election. And so, even when she asked for it, she asked for the reforms. What do we need to do? She's ignoring it, right? And so we have this potential ability to realign our funding with what kids actually need. When this formula, and this formula was a significant legislative accomplishment when it was done in 2007. fully funded just a couple of years ago. It took them that long. It took a child's entire public educational career before they actually put the money to where the formula said they were going to put the money. But they're doing exactly, in the aftermath of that, they're doing exactly what I fear, which is once it's fully funded, they'll simply say, we'll add a percentage that's financially convenient after that, right? We're no longer looking at what kids need. And in the process of that 18, 19 years, what kids need changed dramatically, right? Nobody thought about student mental health needs that were so pervasive 19 years ago, right? It's not in the formula. Right now, one of the things I would love to be able to get is to get school resource officers out of our funding formula. Schools right now, again, just like electric buses, they have to make that impossible choice of whether to pay a police officer, an armed police officer in their school, or fund, I don't know, an advanced placement class for math would actually make their kids competitive with the suburban and urban counterparts. That school resource officer is typically the highest paid employee in the district because, your local sheriff's department is not providing that person at cost. We're literally helping to subsidize their efforts, and they're under financial pressure, right? So, we may, at least I have no information about any other state on this, but we pay upwards of $160,000 for a school resource officer. Now, they're not making that. Part of it's going back to the county sheriff's office or wherever they're coming from. But if you take $160,000 on a district that's only going to raise $100,000 on its tax levy next year, they're literally trying to decide whether to keep a program or whether to keep their kids safe. Well, now, what kind of a choice is that to make in an era when children have such tremendous needs? And we don't have the ability to protect children all in one place at one time. We don't have the right to require that they be there, right? In my mind, how do you say it's the law? You have to send your kid to this place in one time. And by the way, any night of the week, you can learn that that's a target site, right? For some madman, right? So unless you think about, well, we call the state police, dial 911. Yeah, really? In a rural area, they'll be there in 15 minutes. You know how many shots I can fire in 15 minutes?
Oh, it's over by then. It's over.
It's over in 5.
Yeah.
Right? And all they can do is, put out a statement after it's over that they're going to provide counseling. It's horrific. Unless you have somebody who can respond in the moment, you really don't have, you can save your thoughts and prayers because it's happened.
Yeah.
All you can do is triage the living.
Yeah.
Right. And so we'd love to be able to get funding for school resource officers out of the regular funding so that you don't have to make that choice. Every school district from the state should have a school resource officer. And because of the quirk in New York's law that we're municipalities, why in the world can't a school as a municipality send an officer to the Municipal Police Training Academy, just like a town, a village, or a county, and hire their own? Pay them $60,000 and pay. I mean, it would bring the cost down to maybe $100,000 from $160,000. And if we can provide it through BOCES and share that officer back and forth, or share a municipal police force back and forth with them, then we get state reimbursement. So, there are ways to address these seemingly intractable problems, but they take political courage to try and pull off, and they take funding, which also requires political courage.
Yeah.
So, we'll try and convince the legislature that they need to come to the rescue, that they can't sit still for just the governor's proposal. Used to be for years and years, when I worked in the legislature, the assembly would come in with a proposal for public education, and the number would be significantly higher than the governor. The governor would have a number and that would be significantly lower than that, and the Senate would come somewhere in the middle. And they'd negotiate for 3 months, and they'd end up at the Senate number in the middle. That's just the way it worked for 20 years, right? Well, now that the governor and both houses of the legislature are run by the same political party, she becomes the de facto head of everything. And so they have very little authority to move off of her proposals. And in New York, our governor, there have been a boatload of lawsuits. The legislature has sued the governor several times over our funding schemes for different things. And in New York, they can't change the language. All they can do is, and they can't even change amounts without completely defunding it. So the example I always use is the governor were to put in her executive budget proposal, only my brother, who happens to have a construction company, and I don't even know whether she has a brother. This is a purely hypothetical circumstance, okay? But if the governor hypothetically were to say, every prison in New York from now on is going to be built by my brother's construction company, okay? Highly illegal, but the state budget, once passed, is a law in New York. It's a law like anything else, and it supersedes other laws. So if she were to say that, the legislature's only response, they can't line that out. They can't change her word. The only thing that they're allowed to do by law is to defund all prisons, to put zero on the line for corrections. So she has tremendous latitude as she negotiates the budget. And so there needs to be an uproar from the legislature on this, which means that there needs to be an uproar from every school district, from every educational association. Certainly they'll get one from the Rural Schools Association, because the impact on our schools will be profound.
Yeah. Dave, can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, you've had experience for decades around the legislature. So really, when you look at this upcoming session, can you talk about some actionable steps that people that are concerned about the path of rural education can take so that they're able to move a rural agenda?
Yeah, the reason I joined this was because they needed a champion, right? There was nobody in the room. And it was, but when I started, we also had, the Senate was controlled by the Republicans, the Democrats controlled the Assembly, and we switched. We've had both Democrat and Republican governors over the years. And so the political dynamic was such that rural areas always had somebody that they could go to. You know, our rural areas, and we are nonpartisan, right? But we also have to understand how to provide information effectively to the people who are making the decisions. Right now, rural New York is at a political disadvantage in Albany and a political advantage in Washington, simply because the vast majority of representation in rural New York is Republican in an otherwise overwhelmingly Democratic state. Okay. 2/3 of registered voters are Democrats. They're largely living in the urban areas of the state. And that outward migration I talked about exacerbated the problem. There are fewer people voting out there, and they don't have representation that's in the majority party in either house of the legislature or the governor's office. So they have nobody to turn to. So what you do in that circumstance is make sure that you can find like-minded people on both sides of the aisle. And we're very fortunate about that. The people who are in charge of public education on the education committees in both houses of the legislature are friends of public education. They consider themselves to be responsible for advancing the interests of public education, and they're very effective. They're very effective. You were gracious enough to join us at our winter conference, and one of the leaders there was Senator Mayer, who is in fact the head of the Senate Education Committee. And she's very conscientious about making sure that she understands the plight that our rural schools are facing, their challenges and issues. And also, quite honestly, just as importantly, their hopes and dreams. I mean, half of this effort is not just about survival. It's about trying to get rural New York back to what it once was. And, you're way too young to remember, I am not. But back in the mid-'70s in New York State, New York City went functionally bankrupt. And it was only the strength of the upstate rural economy that was able to back the bonds that brought them out of bankruptcy.
Wow.
Well, 50 years later, they've never returned the favor. There is no economic development plan for upstate New York. There are no economic development programs specific to rural New York, and so, we try and work it into the way we address that, work it into, every program that we see to make sure that there's some aspect of it that's actually relevant to what we do. So in answer, you asked me what time it was, and I'm telling you how to make a watch. But I'll get back here to what can we do? We're very fortunate to live in an electronic age because you don't even have to sit down and write a letter to people anymore. All you have to do is hit send. And even though you don't have many people in your community, and even if you're a school official who has a vested interest and they'll recognize you have a vested interest, every school district has got sports boosters and a chamber of commerce, and they've got a local fire department or a volunteer fire department, or they've got faith-based, you've got churches and you've got community organizations, and every one of them has a listserv. And all you have to do is give them the list of legislators for your area and the governor's office and the commissioner of education. Give them those people and give them the template and let them put their specific information into those things. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort on their part to get to those people and tell them what the impact is going to be on them. I used to have legislators call me when we had fax machines and say, call off the dogs, you've just used up the ink in my fax machine. Right? Now we don't even have to do that. Now all we have to do is hit. But I always tell people when we do advocacy events that, when Dave comes to talk to them, it's white noise. They know I get paid to do this. On the other hand, if they don't hear from me, they consider that latitude to do whatever they want. Well, we didn't hear from you, Dave, so how are we supposed to know? Right? So I still have a responsibility to do that, but I can give them facts. And I can give them prognostications about what the likelihood is going to be if they do something. What I can't make them do is care, right? I can't make them care about people. And, I started out wanting to be a marine biologist until I took my first long boat ride and spent it hanging over the rail, but I loved Jacques Cousteau and what he did. And I've always kept his famous quote in the back of my mind. People only save what they love. And that was the reason he did TV shows. I can't get people to save the ocean unless they love the ocean. Right? Well, I can't get people in Albany to act on behalf of rural schools unless they know and understand, if not love, rural New York. Right? And only rural New Yorkers can make them love it. So while I give them facts, only they can make them care. They share constituencies, they share taxpayers, they share voters. And I always tell my people, don't sell yourselves short from an advocacy perspective, because you've got the only two things they care about, their kids and their money. Right? So if you've got those things, use it. Use the leverage. It's really tough. And, it's tough for my people to change things. I once had the state budget director when I was just unlikely event, but that state budget director is now the same guy who is the president of the Rockefeller Institute that wrote the report on changing rural schools, changing all schools, the funding mechanism. Bob Magna is his name, and I once went in and told him all the things I needed to change about the formula. And he said, "Change is great, Dave. You go first." Right? Meaning, the only thing harder to change than state government is public education.
Yeah.
And you guys are not real good about changing what it is you do. Well, we just proved to Bob that we could do it. By doing Portrait of a Graduate, we're doing it. We're upholding our end of that. Right. And so now it's their turn. And if we can get people in rural communities to get to our leaders, and not just their own, because their own don't have the largest voice in the room. Our legislators, they break to caucus, and the Republicans go in one conference room and the Democrats go in the other.
Yep.
The Democrats have enough people sitting in their conference that whatever they decide to do, they can do without the Republicans. And so, and people living in Republican districts, unless they can get to the people on the other side of the aisle and get your message heard in that room, they're not going to understand. Now, conversely, you would hope that their Republican leadership that they have in Congress would be a help in that. I am not finding that to be the case yet. I'm finding our congressional representatives to be very slow to move independently, as I find all of Congress very slow to move independently in the last year. And so I've yet to see that balance on the federal side of things. But we're living with the state implications of it. And so, they need to use what they have. Our rural schools in particular, they are beyond creative. They've learned how to make, the impossible happen with nothing. Right? And so, when the state comes up with a really controversial concept of regionalization, if I go to my rural issues forums and I talk about regionalization, everybody is in an uproar. But if I go to my rural issues forums and I talk about neighbors helping neighbors, they say, that's who we are. Of course we'll do that. Right? And so you've kind of got to be a little artful about the way that you present it. If I've got a program that you need in the district next door, let's figure out how to share that program, at least until the state has enough fortitude to come up with a funding plan that allows both of us to have that program, just like they make sure that Chappaqua or Fire Island or Shelter Island has those programs,
Right.
because they can afford to pay for them themselves. So that's what I would suggest. Get on your laptop. And the other thing I would say is make sure that you meet your own people. I don't want to say that they're irrelevant. They're the loyal minority. And they've got a bully pulpit, and they can stand up on the floor of the legislature and scream and yell and make everybody feel guilty if they're doing the wrong thing. And they need that ammunition to be able to do that. And so I would suggest that people meet their legislators in their district office. If you come to Albany, you're very time limited. I always talk about the fact that in public education, our heart is full of public education. We believe in it. We think it's the future for our kids. It's their way out of poverty. It's their way to the American dream. But when we go in to talk to our legislators, we also have to understand that the person that's coming out the door may have been trying to save homeless veterans. And the person after us may be trying to keep the roads and bridges from falling apart. And the person after that is trying to get the senior citizens fed, right? The state has got a number of legitimate funding interests, but they've only got 4 that are constitutional rights, and public education is one of them. And if I were to tell you, you can't do this podcast because we're suspending the right of freedom of the press, we don't have the cash this month. If I were to tell the electorate that you can't go to church this week, we're suspending freedom of religion because we're a little short. And you're not allowed to meet in public because freedom of assembly, we just don't have enough money for the police this month. We're going to have to cut them. So you're going to have to be on your best behavior and sit in your house for a month while we kind of recalibrate. There'd be a revolution. And yet these children have a constitutional right to a public education that's being ignored. And you have to sue every 10 years to try and enforce that right. And you always win, but the state courts don't have an army to enforce it, right? The state legislature to come forward and do what's right. And so we're at that juncture again now where something has to be done from a funding perspective, and they need to have the fortitude to do it.
Dave, talk about what's next for RSA. What do you want your districts and lawmakers to watch for in the upcoming months?
Well, I want them to see the hard work of staying. 2018 NREA Teacher of the Year, Wade Alette, coined the phrase, talking about people having a tougher time who remain in our rural areas because of people leaving all rural areas. Don't necessarily even leave their own state. But for a long time, it's stabilized now, but for a long time, that was the demographic. That was what was happening. And Wade, early on, 7-8 years ago, recognized the phenomenon and recognized that the people who were remaining had an increased responsibility financially and civically to try and just do what you've always done. And so, I hope that our leaders will read the policy brief, The Hard Work of Staying, and I'll make sure that you get an electric version, Melissa, and hopefully you can send it out. The last time we did this, we called it the Forgotten Family Member, because our governor loved to talk about the family of New York. And I put a Dust Bowl family abandoning their farm in a black and white photo on the front of a document called the Forgotten Family Member, because the state wasn't recognizing what was happening. We had 1 million people walking out the door, and the state wouldn't even talk about it, let alone do anything about it. And so we're calling it the Hard Work of Staying. And the first thing I hope they do is read it, because as you say, it's a prioritized list of the things that can bring rural New York back to a position of strength where we can be helpful to the state. Just briefly, I don't want to get into the weeds with you here, but the fact of the matter is that 50 years ago, New York State had 17 million acres in agricultural production. We have 7 now, right? And we've got 1 million less people than we used to have. It's a different dynamic. There are an awful lot of super Walmarts sitting on farmland, in rural New York. And, people come here and to our rural areas. They know them. They love them. It's vacation paradise in the summer or winter for that matter. But the people who live there, have got to make it work. Mm-hmm. And so our leaders, if they expect people to be there in those areas, and to provide the quality of life that rural life provides to people, which can happen these days now that, we work very hard on broadband access, and we have very few pockets anymore where we don't have broadband access. And so businesses can locate in our rural areas and people can live in our rural areas. I have 2 key bank vice presidents that live outside of Lake Placid now. They're husband and wife, and they alternate Fridays going to New York City, but they wanted to raise their children in a rural setting. They didn't want to be on Park Avenue, right? And Keene Valley, where they live outside of Lake Placid, had the broadband that allows them to do that. New York's rural areas truly can help. They can help bring the state to a position of prominence, but you can't do it doing what you did 30, 20, 10 years ago.
That's right. So, Dave, I always end with the same question, and that is, what does the term rural advantage mean to you?
To me, it means what rural life is that you can't get anyplace else. Okay. I've joked with my people in Western New York. I grew up, my first job was detasseling corn for Funk Brothers Seed Company in Normal, Illinois. You can't get more rural than pulling corn in the middle of Illinois. Right? You can start on a row at 7 o'clock in the morning and turn around to go back at noon. Right? There's a lot of corn, right? And the experience of growing up there was much different. And I've lived in suburban areas, and I've certainly, especially when 32 years of working for one aspect of the state, people say, I say, where are you from? And they'll say, you can't possibly have heard of it. And I will tell them, not only will I guarantee you that I've heard of it, I'll tell you 2 things about it, because I will guarantee you that I've been there. Right? So, once you've been around and seen it, you know what the hopes and dreams are, and you know what the challenges and issues are. Right? And so when I talk about the rural advantage, I talk about the position that a school has in a rural community. I will say this. I'm going to Letchworth, New York. We at Letchworth State Park, they call it Grand Canyon of New York. It's a glorious place. Couldn't be more rural. It's about an hour south of Rochester. And I've got to go there and speak on Saturday. And I was driving back through there in the middle of the recession. And I drove through the middle of town, and my immediate thought was, the recession has decimated this place. There wasn't a human being walking downtown. There wasn't a car parked. And I was feeling horrible for Letchworth until I got 2 miles out of town, And I had to slow down to like 2 miles an hour because not only was the parking lot full at the school, but both sides of the highway were crammed with cars. Like everybody in that county had to be at the school. And that tells you the role that the school plays. You know, if little Davy Little in the 5th grade is walking down Highway 42 in the middle of nowhere at 10 o'clock on a weekday, there's going to be 10 calls to the school because everybody knows where Dave's supposed to be. Right? When I talk about the rural advantage, your kid will graduate. I don't care what their challenge is. Your kid's going to graduate from a rural school in New York. We have a high 90s percentile of graduation. We will figure out a way to make it work for your child in rural New York, one way or another. Here's the problem. Our dirty little secret is that 3 out of 4 of those kids will never get anything but that high school diploma, right? Not a 2-year college, not a business certificate, not a 4-year degree. You get that high school diploma. And so that's our challenge going forward. We do a tremendous job with what we've got. That's the rural advantage. We will know your child. We will make sure that they're ready to the best of our ability. But they're going to compete with people who have had an academically superior experience. That's the challenge.
Well, you've done an excellent job quantifying what rural New York looks like right now and really putting rural New York at the center of the policy table and laying out concrete steps that leaders can use right now, things to think about, things that legislators in your state can think about, whether it's smarter funding architecture or realistic timelines for mandates, the issues that rural leaders are grappling with right now, and really partnerships that can expand opportunity without losing that local identity. So Dave, thank you so much for spending some time with me today and really letting us know what the lay of the land in rural New York is.
The last thought I would leave with you, Melissa, is what I've learned over the years is that state leaders, you know, the unknown part about their job is that they care. You know, they are capable people and they care. For all of the criticism that people have with state representatives, the fact of the matter is that, you know, we have a responsibility to make sure that they understand, because nobody can be as expert as we expect across the full panoply of issues that society faces. Right. And people walk in with all those issues I mentioned all the time, and we expect them to know what to do about them. We can't do that. We have to be the experts and tell them what they need to do about those things. And so as long as we do that, and as long as they care, because we've made the connection by bringing them into our schools and making them understand what's going on, I truly believe that rural schools can provide not only a way of life, but an example for everybody about how we can work together to make society work. And I don't think that we've got much of a bigger challenge than trying to bring people back together in America right now. And in rural New York, rural America in general, you know, we've always said that rural America fights, feeds, and fuels America. You know, fights for, feeds, and fuels America because we populate those areas, the military and those other things, agriculture more than our population would indicate. But we also have an example of helping that person next to us that needs it.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think if the more we can serve as an example for that, the more we can show people that works, then I think the better chance we have of truly making America great.
Yeah, well said. Thank you for that.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So friends, if this conversation sharpened your next move in your state and your rural community, carry one idea into your board briefing or community coffee this week and explain the why behind the ask. Invite a partner in and take a first step forward toward that collaboration. If the Rural Scoop is helping you lead with clarity and courage, please like this episode, subscribe to the show, and leave a comment with your takeaway. Share it with a colleague who cares about rural schools in your area too, because those signals help other leaders find us, and I read every note. I'm your host, Melissa Sadorf, and remember, in rural leadership, our strength is our shared story. When we lead together, we thrive together. See you next time.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Rural Scoop. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these important rural conversations going. And we'd love to hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment or share your thoughts. You can follow along and never miss a new release by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform or by following us on social. We're on YouTube at The Rural Scoop, Instagram at 𝐿𝐴𝐷𝐿𝐴1, and X at 𝐿𝐴𝐷𝐿𝐴03. The Rural Scoop is produced with support from 𝐏𝐨A Educational Consultants. To learn more, visit 𝐏𝐴consultants.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education. And as always, keep leaning in to the rural advantage.